I've once heard this phrase: it's better to go skiing and think of God than to go to church and think of skiing. I'm gauging, I'm looking out there, I'm thinking, I know what I'm thinking about today. Well, let's just say that I think of God often when I ski. I pray all the time when I am skiing. Sometimes out of sheer gratitude, and others for my safety, and for the safety of everyone around me, especially when I hit a patch of ice, which is New England skiing at its finest. Now, learning to ski here in Vermont, I think is a good thing, because if you can ski here, you can ski anywhere, right? We all know this to be true. I quickly understood what the term skied off means. I had no idea what that was before I started to ski here. And now I know what is skied off, how often things are skied off, and that's not really enjoyable for someone like me to ski when everything is skied off. But I've learned in those conditions how to slide and scrape down the slopes. Over the years, I have learned a little bit better how to ski in all different types of conditions, and especially when it is icy and many things are skied off. I've learned the key. I won't call it a trick. I should have learned it a long time ago, but here it is. Find the snow. Find where the snow is and ski there. And usually the snow is along the edge. Not always, but usually. And you've got to make some quicker turns to stay on the edge, but the edge is where you want to be. I see many of you nodding your heads. You're like, yes, that is right. Usually the snow, whatever is left, or the best snow, is along the edge. Those areas of the terrain that I hardly spent any time in my first few years of skiing, because I just stayed right in the middle, right where everyone else skied. Now, if you ask my boys, of course, where the real snow is and where the real fun is, they say it's not really on the edges, it's into the woods. Into the trees they go. Sometimes I follow them, and the truth is, it is really fun. Well, today's lectionary text, Jesus is back in his hometown. We continue the passage that we've looked at the last couple of weeks. If you remember the past few weeks, Jesus has returned to his hometown of Nazareth. And he went to worship in the synagogue, and he read the scroll from Isaiah, and he delivered what we call his inaugural address. And we read that initially everyone spoke very well of him. They were amazed at his gracious words that came from his mouth. Not surprising, because his hometown would be proud of him. They've heard the stories of Jesus, of what he has done all around the area, the following that he has developed. And so his hometown would want to hear this good news. Now remember, they too were living under Roman rule and various levels of oppression and poverty. So Jesus coming with this news that the year of the Lord's favor is now, of course, his hometown would think, this is what we want to hear. Preach, right? This messianic hope anticipated the end of oppression, the end of injustice and exploitation, and really the inauguration of a new age. This is what they were waiting for. And all of those things were the central tenets of the faith and the life of Israel. As one biblical commentator writes, if faith is not merely wishful thinking, then there comes a moment in human history when God acts to fulfill what God has promised. It is the realization of this hope that Jesus announces as being fulfilled in him. So they were amazed at his gracious words. But this good news, as he continued, wasn't exactly what they expected. Because Jesus began to speak about God's activity in the strangest of places, in the midst of outsiders, or at least outsiders to the established community of faith. Jesus then brings to mind stories that his audience would have known, stories of individuals most representative of the marginalized Gentiles, another term of non-Jewish. Different beliefs, different culture, different heritage, different ways of being. Gentiles. They were all kind of lumped together. Jesus talks about the widow who was obedient and faithful to God, willing to give the last of what she had in order for her house to receive a blessing from God. It's a great story. She endured a severe famine in the land and did not allow the apparent lack of resources to interfere with her relationship with the prophet Elijah and what Elijah had asked her to do. A remarkable story of faith from someone who Jesus' contemporaries would have thought was unfaithful. She wasn't Jewish. Naaman, and a different story, and a different prophet, Elisha. Naaman was initially resistant to these prophetic instructions, but eventually he listened. He immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan River and was healed of his leprosy. But he was a leader in the Syrian army. He was a stranger, a foreigner. He epitomized an actual, tangible threat to the Israelites, opposing army, opposing nation. He was the one that God chose to heal. You see, both of these stories that Jesus intentionally shared, they represented the other to that synagogue crowd. And it was at this point that their initial astonishment turns to anger. They understood that Jesus' message at this point was not going to simply be a stamp of approval on their assumptions, on their comfort, and their preconceived ideas of God and who God favors and who God does not, who God welcomes and who God does not, who God shows mercy on and who God does not. Jesus makes it very clear that the way they saw things and people is different. So Jesus came not to maintain the status quo, not to stay necessarily on that one path, that one slope that everyone was on, but he brought a message intended to dismantle the status quo and the stereotypes that defined the religious and the social boundaries of his day. Peter Gomes, now deceased, was a remarkable theologian. He was the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals at Harvard Divinity School. And about this specific lectionary text that we just read, he remarks, "The people take offense, not so much with what Jesus claims about himself, as with the claims he makes about a God who is more than their own tribal deity." As author Anne Lamott says, "You can safely assume that you've created God in your own image when it turns out that God hates all the same people you do." So Jesus is actually declaring judgment, Sometimes we don't like to think of Jesus that way, but it's true. But see, the judgment is not against the outsiders. Rather, it's against those not willing to accept and embrace the people on the edge. And as can happen when a prophetic message confronts the status quo and is a challenge to those people and places of power and privilege, Jesus' message was rejected. In fact, the story says Jesus himself was rejected. They wanted nothing to do with him at this point. They tried to actually drive him out of the town and harm him. So Jesus understood and understands rejections. Now, if you Google famous rejections, you will learn that J.K. Rowling, anyone know J.K. Rowling? Yes? Author of the Harry Potter series, was rejected by 12 different publishers before her work was accepted. One of them even advised her not to quit her day job. You'll also discover that just after one performance, Elvis Presley was fired by Jimmy Denning, the manager at the Grand Ole Opry. Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, was rejected 30 times before it was published. Director Steven Spielberg was rejected 3 times for admission to the University of Southern California School of Theater, Film, and Television. I'm sure they wish that they, said, come on in. But listen, all those rejections didn't stop these individuals from pursuing their calling. And it didn't stop Jesus either. He just gets going. This rejection in Nazareth doesn't bring an end to this mission of God in Jesus Christ. We will see that in lectionary texts down the road. In fact, it only serves to further Jesus' sense of calling and his mission, which I like to phrase it this way: to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. So let me ask you, in our time and place, in our context today, who are the people on the edges? Who are the people living on the margins, the marginalized? Is it people of other religious faiths and traditions? The homeless, the poor, those without access to adequate medical care, housing and education, the undocumented immigrants, the millions of uprooted and displaced people all over the world. See, along the edges is where you find the snow. Along the edges is also where you find God at work, especially with those facing unfavorable or impossible conditions. For those in society facing hostility and hatred, bigotry and prejudice, arrogance and ignorance, on a societal level and on a national level. God is along the edge, has always been, and always will be. My best skiing, when I ski the best, and I have the best day, especially on tough ski days, is when I follow the line of someone who I consider to be an expert skier. I have probably followed some of you. That's when I ski the best. Because this person knows where to find the snow. They know which path to take. Friends, Jesus is inviting us along the edge. We have an opportunity to follow Christ and to contribute to that renewing, redeeming story that is God's. That God is still alive and active and at large in our world. And we have an opportunity to follow. But we need to know where to find. And we come alive on the edges of the human family and the faith community. Along the edges, we witness what God is doing in our world, in unlikely places and through unlikely people. To follow Jesus along the edge, it is to believe that God is indeed creating a new story, a new narrative of hope and justice and mercy. It is to know the fullness of the love of God in Jesus Christ and the overwhelming power of God's story, even in our time. This is good news for all people. And we have an opportunity in our day, in our time, to follow our leader, to follow Christ's lines, and to find God along the edge. May it be so. Amen.